Hello, my name is Joseph Elliott. Some of you might recognize me from my past work as an actor. So I've done a lot of work on CBeebies and CBBC, including Swashbuckle and Big Fat Like. So I started my career as an actor, and off the back of that, I started doing more writing. So I started writing for myself as a performer, and then started doing TV script work. So on shows like Swashbuckle and Class Dismissed and Horrible Histories. But I'd always had this ambition to write a novel one day as well. Yeah, so I started taking the writing a little bit more seriously. And I'm now the author of three published books, which are a trilogy, a fantasy trilogy for teens, which starts with The Good Hawk. That's the first book in the series. And then the second is The Broken Raven. And the third is The Burning Swift. And they are a fantasy trilogy in a kind of Game of Thrones-esque medieval version of Scotland and the Isle of Skye, with kind of warring clans and magical creatures and dark kind of shadows, yeah, lots of brave heroes as well.
I I always loved writing, and this sounds like such a typical writer's answer. But at school, English was my favourite subject. I loved reading. I was really lucky that I was brought up in a house full of books. My parents were both voracious readers. And I think it was the love of reading that made me want to write. And I hesitate to say this now because it sounds awful, but I didn't really think of writing as being a proper job. It didn't feel like something I could make a living at. So I went to university and I did drama and English, which I loved. And then I thought, well, now I have to get a proper job. And I got a couple of proper jobs, and I ended up in local government, which I became quite senior, which I think is quite funny now, because I was really like, I don't know, I was like Mae West at a Morris dance or something. I was so out of place, really. But I always kind of thought, one day I'll write a book, one day I'll write a book. And then when I was in my early 30s, I had a car accident which left me with chronic back problems, and I had to give up working full time. So then I became a very grumpy receptionist part time. And that gave me the kick up the butt I needed to start writing, because it kind of took away the excuse. I've got the time now to do it. And I'm not in a job that's really demanding, so I need to start writing. So I started writing, and I sort of roughly got a novel into shape, and I got signed by an agent, and it was all going reasonably well. And then I had a diagnosis of breast cancer, which meant that I had to sort of stop writing for a bit, reassess. Then I realized that actually it was an opportunity, because when I was having chemo, I struggled to sleep. And so I decamped to the spare bedroom and I just started writing, because there's a problem when you have cancer. You tend to be, people kind of, that's all they see about you. It's a weird thing, but my experience was, people got very careful around me. It was like, oh God, she's got cancer. And it almost became your identity, which I really didn't want. So writing gave me something else. And I spent the time while I was having chemo actually writing. And that became my first novel, which was The Keeper of Lost Things. So I always like to say, I spent my time having cancer very constructively writing a novel. But actually it was great for me, and it was a real escape. And then I was lucky enough to get signed by an agent, and it just took off to a ridiculous level. And I think I spent the first couple of years like a rabbit in the headlights. I knew nothing about the industry at all. I just thought, wouldn't it be lovely to get published? So I was really interested in the writing side of things. But then I realized that there was all this other stuff that came with it. And the book ended up being published in about 32 territories across the world. So for a debut novel, it was a bit of a baptism of fire. And I still kind of sit back every now and again and think, wow, did that really happen? Because now I'm back at my desk writing away, and so it's a kind of a weird world. But that's really how I became a writer. That's how it started.
Hi, I'm Andy Merriman. I'm an author and script writer, and I started writing 100 years ago for television. I did some sketches for Russ Abbott and Mike Yarwood, and other sketches for other shows, and a couple of sitcoms. And I was working then with my dad, who was a celebrated comedy writer, Eric Merriman, who used to write for Tommy Cooper, Dave Allen, anyone you could name, too humorous to mention. And he wrote a radio show called Beyond Our Ken, which was well known. We wrote a few radio series. And then I went on to writing books, some biographies, a couple of novels, and then got into ghosting. I ghosted books for various people, footballers and rock stars, and in fact I worked with Kevin Kilban on his book, and who's a patron of the Down Syndrome Association. So I've now written about 16 books, and I've done about 30 radio shows.
One of my main characters in the book is a girl called Agatha, who has Down syndrome. And she is one of the two main protagonists in the book. So the book is told alternately from the two different perspectives. So half the book is told from her perspective. She is a member of a clan that live on the northernmost tip of Skye, that get invaded and enslaved by kind of Viking-esque warriors from across the sea. And she then has to cross the mainland to try and rescue her family. She's a very kind of bold, feisty, fearless character. She doesn't take no for an answer. She's very confident, very loving. She's very loyal to her clan. And yeah, I love her to bits. I think she's awesome.
The character that I wrote, my characters sort of turn up in my head. It's a very odd thing, but they just arrive quite often. And Sunshine is the name of the character in my book who has Down syndrome, and she just happened to have Down syndrome. I didn't ever set out to write a character that had Down syndrome. This character came to me, and she actually has a special ability. The premise of the book is there's an old guy who is the keeper of lost things. He loses something that's really, really important to him on a special day in his life. And he then begins gathering in all the things, the lost items that he finds. And Sunshine is a bit of a lost soul, and he gathers her in after he's died, in that he leaves all his property to his housekeeper. But there's a codicil in the will that says, and there's this young woman who I've often seen sitting on a bench outside the house. If you could offer her some friendship, that would be really good. But Sunshine isn't. She is a character in her own right. She happens to have Down syndrome, but she also has another special skill in that she can sense things from the lost objects. So it's not. She's not psychic, but she has this heightened sensitivity, if you like, to the history of these things. And I thought very long and hard about including her as a character, because I knew that if I got it wrong, I would be pilloried, I would be criticised from every angle, and rightly so. So I knew that if I included Sunshine with her abilities and perceived disabilities, that I would have to get it right. But one of the things that I was determined to do was to show Sunshine as a very strong character who was not defined by the fact that she had Down syndrome. That just happened to be one of her characteristics. She's a very strong character, and she sees the world in a very clear way.
Well, in 1992, when I was still writing with Dad, my daughter Sarah was born with Down syndrome. And so we kind of created her in two different senses, really, because I suggested to Dad that we write a comedy drama for radio about a family with a child with Down syndrome. And initially he was a bit concerned about how we could get humor out of it. And I said, no, we can. We're not making fun of people. It's what it's like. And so the show starred, it was on Radio 4, it starred Peter Davison, who we cast Peter Davison, who happened to be a patron of the Down Syndrome Association, which we didn't know. Just coincidentally, we wanted him as the father. And he was great. He had a cousin with Down syndrome. Samantha Bond played the mum. And the producer said, I mean, I wasn't sure how we were going to have Sarah involved. She was only 3 at the time. I thought we would just have a few noises off. But he said, no, let's bring her into the studio and have her there. We'll create a family atmosphere. And we built up her part. I mean, she demanded it. And so she had a few lines and everything, and it worked very well. In fact, Gareth Edwards, the producer, said she was one of the easiest actresses he'd worked with, and the only one who wasn't potty trained. So we also had it hadn't been our intention to put Sarah in it, but anyway, it did work very well, and it was really the first radio series that featured anything to do with learning disability. I mean, I can't find anything else that came before us. So it kind of broke new ground and created a lot of publicity. And in one of the episodes, we also had an actor called Pius Hickey, a young man who played the suitor of Sarah's sister. And he was terrific, really, and he came into the studio, was very professional, and we tried not to patronize him. We tried not to create too many stereotypes about him, and I think that worked well. So that was the series. It went out on Radio 4. It was repeated lots of times, and then from that, I was contacted by an editor at Macmillan, Susan Hill, there'd been a lot of publicity in magazines and interviews, and asked me if I would write a book about what it's really like to have a child with Down syndrome, a real story, not a drama or a fictional account, but a kind of true account. And I talked it over with my wife, Alison, and we thought it had to be very truthful. It had to be, because there'd been 2 or 3 books, but they were either rose-colored glasses or they just weren't realistic, really. We thought, if we're going to do this, we've got to make it realistic and truthful and quite brutal at times. So I and Ali and some family members all contributed to the book, which was called A Minor Adjustment. And it was amazing, really, because it was serialized. There was a bidding war between two newspapers, ended up being in the Mail, and for quite a lot of money. And I'd said I was working as a social worker at the time, and I'd said to Alison, I've done this for too long now. I've done it for nearly 30 years. I want to crack at writing full time. And then the book was serialized, and I made enough money to give up the day job. So it was really through Sarah, an unlikely source, really, from how we felt at the beginning, that she was able to allow me to give up my day job. And the book was very successful, and I think made a lot of difference to a lot of parents, would-be parents of babies and children with Down syndrome at the time. So that changed my life, really, changed all our lives. And Sarah's birth, of course, changed our lives in many ways. But personally, as an author, as a writer, she set me up for a new career.
Children with Down syndrome have been a big part of my life for as long as I can remember. My parents used to do respite foster care for lots of different children with additional needs, including lots of kids with Down syndrome. I've got a cousin who has Down syndrome. And then a lot of my kind of early days jobs were working with children with additional needs, first at a holiday play scheme and then at a special educational needs school in Westminster. So I spent a lot of time kind of working and teaching children with Down syndrome. And when I started coming up with the idea for the book, it occurred to me that I'd never read a book with a main character with Down syndrome, certainly not a kind of teen fantasy book like mine are, with a character that was kind of proudly front and center with a disability. And so I wanted to create a character that the children that I knew, the children that I was working with and used to teach could be inspired by and look up to, as well as creating a character that maybe challenged other people's preconceptions of what it meant to have Down syndrome.
In my writing, I always like to explore characters who are slightly different from mainstream. So the characters that interest me are characters who have maybe different abilities or special abilities. And when I wrote Sunshine, I didn't set out to write a Down syndrome character. I set out to write a character who happened to have Down syndrome. And that distinction was very important to me because Sunshine has other abilities, special abilities, that were more important in terms of the novel. But her Down syndrome is a strength in the book as well, because she sees life through a particular lens. And her role in the novel, if you like, is it's almost like she's an emotional and moral compass, in that she calls things out when she sees them. She doesn't self-censor, she doesn't have a filter. So her voice is a very clear voice in the novel of truth. So if she sees people behaving badly, she won't think, what's the best way of saying that? She will just say it. And so you have two other adults in the novel who she's friends with and associated with, but she's always calling them out. And there's that kind of strange contrast between them feeling that they're actually looking after her and caring for her, but they're not. In many ways, she's the one who is showing them the way forward. And one of the things that I particularly liked about Sunshine is that she has this real inner strength, and it's very quiet, but she insists on being heard. She won't be spoken over, and if people don't listen to her, she just has this quiet strength about her. And the other thing that I was keen to do was to make sure that Sunshine was able to define herself, because very often people who have disabilities end up being defined by other people and by their disability. And Sunshine has her own way of defining herself. She describes herself as being dancing drone, not Down syndrome. And that's her definition. And she has specific words for things. And that's her way of controlling her situation. She says, this is who I am, and I will tell you who I am, and I will tell you how I'm defined.
I'm currently writing a novel, which I've been doing for quite a while. During lockdown, it seemed the right thing to do, rather than chasing around interviewing people for biographies and autobiographies. And of course, thought I've got to have a character with Down syndrome in it, and he's a teenage boy, one of the principal characters at the moment. And having had two boys as well as Sarah, I kind of got to know all about teenage boys, although they're much older, they're a bit older now. And he's just what I'm trying to do with him is not, Down syndrome isn't the be all and end all with his character. It's almost kind of incidental. So he's a teenage boy with lots of friends and interests and activities. Football mad, of course, like all our family are. So he's in development, I would say. But I wanted to, it's a world I know, of course, very well now. And so I wanted to have a character with a boy with Down syndrome as in the main part of the novel. And it's I'm hoping to finish it this year, and I am looking for a publisher. If there's anyone out there that wants to publish this, I haven't sent it off to anybody yet. But anyway, so and it's about a ghostwriter, because I know a lot about that too. Write what you know is always what they say, isn't it? So yeah, I wanted to create a fictional character with Down syndrome.
When writing the character of Agatha, I drew on a lot of kind of inspiration from the children that I used to teach and work with, as well as my cousin who has Down syndrome, and created a character that kind of had elements of all of them, as well as some aspects that came from my own imagination. Obviously, I was very conscious of making sure that it was an authentic representation, or as authentic as I could make it. So once I finished the first draft of the manuscript, my editors then sent it out to various sensitivity readers who either had Down syndrome or were the parents of someone with Down syndrome, and they kind of read it and fed back. And I then made kind of few kind of tweaks and changes throughout the manuscript based on their feedback.
So before I wrote the book, in terms of experience of people with Down syndrome, I had experience of small children and babies in one of my jobs. And then an ex-partner of mine, long-term ex-partner, his brother had Down syndrome. So I'd had a fair bit of personal contact and personal experience. But I also did some research. I'm a bit of a documentary-aholic, if that's such a word. I love watching documentaries, and there was a particularly good one about young people with Down syndrome called Growing Up Downs, and it was about a group of young actors with Down syndrome and some other learning disabilities who were putting on a touring production of Hamlet. And one of the things that particularly interested me was the difficulties that some of the actors had in distinguishing between real life and the play. So, for example, the actor who was playing Hamlet, his real life girlfriend was playing Ophelia, and she got terribly upset when Hamlet was telling her, get thee to a nunnery, and basically getting rid of her. And she thought he was dumping her in real life. So I found that really interesting, the way that the lines were becoming blurred between real life and fiction. And my character Sunshine in the book is the truth. She can't see anything else. She only speaks the truth. So that was a really interesting piece of research for me to do. But also, in terms of speech patterns, I did some research into speech patterns and certain commonalities in people with Down syndrome, and that is that very often, in terms of language, they understand far more and in a far more sophisticated way than the way that they speak. So their actual spoken language skills are not so good. And Sunshine, my character, has particular words for things. She has her own words for some things, but also she speaks about the lovely cup of tea. So she mixes the and and that was one of the other things that I did research in, because I wanted her to be an authentic character. I wanted to be respectful and to do enough research to make sure that her character was authentic and honest and an accurate portrayal.
My experience with Down syndrome before Sarah was born was that I had worked as a social worker And I had a few clients with learning disabilities and some with Down syndrome. And so and this was in the 70s. And so I knew a bit about learning disability and Down syndrome from there. But of course, that's in the days when you know, people with Down syndrome were only just were sent for education, were given education, were day centres were all the rage. And it was a sort of far cry from where we are now. But I did know a little bit about learning disability. And then, of course, when Sarah was born, I learned my experiences about was mainly changing nappies at that stage. But being immersed ourselves, our world became immersed in portage and occupational therapy and all the help that you could get. So by the time we began to write the radio series, you know, Sarah was 3, I think, 3 or 4, and so we knew quite a lot about that world. And the research that we'd undertaken really was for Sarah herself rather than for a character. So that was a kind of odd juxtaposition. And also Sarah was, we'd call the mother's name Sarah, because we hadn't really realized that Sarah herself would be in it. So we had to give Sarah a different name. She was Amy, and Sarah still refers to her stage name as Amy, and her radio mum and her radio dad. And we also got a bit of a tangent. We also got my oldest son, Daniel, to play the odd line. And my mother, who was a professional chaperone, also was involved. So we had the whole family involved in that show. But the research really came from real life, I have to say.
The response to the book and to Agatha in particular has been totally overwhelming and incredible. Everyone's just really taken her to their hearts and embraced her. And yeah, it's just been an absolute joy. People kind of contacting me on social media, saying how grateful they are to have someone with Down syndrome in a book like this for children, or to see themselves reflected in a book. I had one parent who even messaged me to say that they had a child with Down syndrome who was nonverbal, and they felt like they were hearing their child speaking for the first time, which, you know, that kind of feedback just meant the absolute world to me. That what I hoped Agatha would be able to do, people are kind of seeing that in her and embracing her in such a positive way.
A lovely response from readers, a mixed response. There have been a few people who've contacted me and said that it's not an accurate portrayal. But interestingly, they're usually people who don't have personal experience or that much knowledge of people with Down syndrome. I have been accused on occasion that it's a patronizing character. Or rather, I've patronised the character, but I've had far more positive response from people contacting me directly on social media who have children with Down syndrome or siblings with Down syndrome. And one of the most gratifying things was, it's so lovely to see a character in a book that happens to have Down syndrome, but whose function in the book is not there to have Down syndrome. You know, she has a different role in the book, but she happens to have Down syndrome. And I had one lady contact me. She's so lovely. She said, my daughter has Down syndrome, but she wants to be an actress. If this book ever gets made into a film or a TV series, please will you consider her to play the role of Sunshine, which was lovely. And then the other amazing thing was that it was picked up by a college in the US, because it was published in the US as well, and it was actually taught on the English syllabus there, but for the specific reason that it had a character with Down syndrome as a mainstream character in a book that was commercial fiction. because it just doesn't happen that often. I mean, thankfully, since the book was written, I think it's that situation has improved, and we are seeing more people represented in fiction and in theatre and in film. But certainly at the time, it was sufficiently rare for it to be picked up by a college in America and actually taught on the syllabus, which was amazing. But generally speaking, the response has been really positive, and you know, people have said it's an accurate portrayal, bearing in mind that, you know, not all people with Down syndrome can be portrayed in the same way. You know, it's just one facet of who they are. So, you know, there are commonalities, but there are far more individual characteristics and personality traits. So I'm glad I did it. And the response has been very positive, and I still get readers contacting me saying it's so nice to have this character, and you have portrayed it accurately. And I've had some people say that they've actually read the book to their siblings or their sons and daughters, just to say, look, you know, here's someone like you in a book, in fiction.
The video series created quite a stir. And Sarah and I were asked to appear on all sorts of, we were on Richard and Judy. And just before we were about to go on, the floor manager said, you know, 4 million people watch this live. I said, oh, thanks very much. Just what I wanted to hear. Sarah, of course, was absolutely so courageous and brave, absolutely without any concerns, worries, anxieties. And Peter Davison was with us, so he calmed us all down. But it created a lot of interest, and I think I've had so many people, particularly women who've had babies with Down syndrome, coming up to me and saying how much it helped them. One woman who was pregnant and said she wasn't sure whether they could keep it or not, and then she read my book, and then and I said, what happened? And she pointed to a teenager, and she said, that's what happened. And I just felt extraordinary, really. So in terms of the impact of the radio series was extraordinary and much more than we'd ever thought, really, and the book even more so. And we've been asked to I became a trustee of the Down Syndrome Association after that, and asked to speak at many different conferences and things. So the whole life changed completely. All our lives changed completely. And you know, I've done a radio series, I've done a book and a sequel. So I've really exploited Sarah as much as I could for my writing career.
So my message would be to always be yourself. That is the kind of mantra that Agatha lives her life by. And I think we can all learn a lot from her kind of self-belief and confidence in herself. She proves throughout the novels that it's her differences that make her so amazing, and you are exactly the same.
What I would say is that we should always assess people on their abilities rather than define them by their disabilities. Because everyone is an individual, and I think that we should respect every person as an individual and look for their abilities rather than be distracted by their perceived disabilities.
When Sarah was born, so we obviously had the support of family, friends, other parents, and the Down Syndrome Association, but there was very little on the internet, if anything, really. And since then, of course, now there's incredible global support, love and kindness, really, from people in the community. And we owe so much to this community, the Down syndrome community, which has given us so much over the years. So proud to be part of it. And so wishing everybody a very happy World Down Syndrome Day, or as Sarah might say, let's all smash it.